All right, welcome everybody to the next talk in our series of evidence-based medicine for the Base Station Physicians Committee. We are very pleased today to welcome Dr. Kelly Motadel to speak on the topic of pediatric potpourri, an old classic and new trends. Dr. Motadel is our child health officer for the County of San Diego, and previously she was the chief medical officer at the Vista Community Clinic, which is a federally qualified health center serving 70,000 patients annually across San Diego, Riverside, and Orange County. And she is a fabulous speaker. I've heard her many times, so we are really looking forward to her talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koenig. That's so kind of you. I'm going to work to share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right, I'm hoping you all can see that. Dr. Koenig, if you can't, let me know. So great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I love pediatrics, can't imagine all the adults that you all take care of. So I'm hoping I can impart some pediatric wisdom on you all who don't see peds quite as often, or perhaps have the opposite fear that I have. Adults scare me, but I've heard that children scare some of you. So I'm hoping to allay some of that and go over some things that were requested by many of you to talk about today. Okay, why am it not advancing? Hold on 1 second. Okay, there we go. All right, so I think I skipped over a slide that I have no financial disclosures or relationships to disclose. So we're going to talk about, as Dr. Koenig said, a potpourri of things. So febrile seizures is something that you all have seen for many, many years and has a lot of literature behind it, pretty established protocols, but request to review some of that today. So we will do that, but we'll also talk about some of these new things that we've been seeing out on the streets and out in our community that are definitely coming through calls to you all as well. And so we're going to see this little guy a few times throughout the presentation today, because he sort of represents this toddler that you're called with a chief complaint of a seizure. And what that means to a family can be very different than what it means to a medical community. So we're going to use him for a few different scenarios with different descriptors. And so in this scenario, the mom says, when I laid him down in his crib, he kind of went rigid and started shaking and crying. And so perhaps you get this call and you show up and you go to attend to the child and you happen to notice this little canister on the table near where the crib is at, and don't think too much of it until mom mentions that, oh my, there were some gummy bears in there that maybe he had eaten, that she's not sure. And these certainly look innocent enough, but so do a lot of things that are edible and have other ingredients to them. And so this is what we are seeing more and more commonly now, unfortunately, is accidental ingestions of cannabis or THC in toddlers and in young children, because they do look so yummy. In fact, when I was working on this particular slide, my daughter, who is 9 today, actually walked in the room and said, "Ooh, Mom, are you talking about candy in your talk?" And I said, "Not the kind you can have." And she said, "That looks just like my gummy bears." And that's the problem, that a lot of these, just like we are now hearing very recently on the news about the rainbow fentanyl that look like sweet tarts, which I quickly showed her a picture of also to avoid. Both legitimate drug manufacturers or those that are making legal marijuana edibles, as well as those who are not on the legal front, are trying to appeal to children, and not necessarily trying to appeal to toddlers, but oftentimes teenagers are also attracted to candy as well, or things that look like it. And so as a result, the companies are definitely starting to fight back, because things don't just look like gummy bears or the sweet tarts, like I mentioned with rainbow fentanyl, but Skittles and Starburst and chocolate bars and a number of other things. And so we are seeing an increased number of these accidental ingestions or unintentional ingestions in toddlers. So the bottom graph there shows you for adults, the percent in a Gallup poll that said yes, that they had tried marijuana in the green on the green bar. You can see that going up, particularly over the last decade, increasing amounts to where we're at nearly half of US adults have said that they have tried marijuana. But also on that lower, smaller bar that are particularly smoking marijuana, although it has gone up, not quite at the same rate. And that's because there's this increased amount of edibles available now. Unfortunately, as that top graph will show you that the calls to poison control, therefore, have also increased for children 12 and under ingesting those edibles. And sometimes in littler kids, it may look a little different. So of course, they can be sleepy, but they could have other behavioral changes, including euphoria or irritability. They also, although may have some of those other symptoms that you're used to seeing in teenagers and adults with tachycardia or hypertension with large amounts, they could also have bradycardia, but also what's considered a large overdose, maybe not really what's considered a large amount for a teen or an adult. So in that patient case I gave you, that was actually a story that made national news. That little guy had 15 of those gummies, and each one of those gummies had 5 milligrams of marijuana, so of cannabis. So that is quite a large dose. This little guy could have gone into a coma. That could have been a real seizure. That's an amount that even someone who uses, an adult who uses very regularly would be considered a high dosage for. So this has been looked at now, NIH study that looked at unintentional cannabis ingestion in children. These unintentional ingestions, of course, are for younger children, the average age being about 25 months, so about 2 years. These kids are often kept in either the ER or admitted to the hospital as a result, with an average stay of just over a day, but they can get pretty sick. So almost 1/5 of them are admitted to the ICU, and 6% of this group that was looked at were actually intubated. Okay, moving on to the next topic of near drowning. And if you are feeling like some of these cases look familiar, these are cases locally that have appeared just in the last month in our community, unfortunately. And is what I think struck me when I was looking at these cases is that some of these things don't seem so unusual. So a toddler in floaties, you could probably find at almost any pool, but that may not be sufficient to keep that toddler afloat. We unfortunately do hear about parents sort of delegating responsibility to the sibling taking a bath with a younger sibling. And in this case, that in many cases, that's not sufficient. Sometimes parents do everything right. So they have the swim vest on, they have eyes on them, but the minute that swim vest comes off does not mean the child knows that swim time is over, and they may continue to explore in that pool area. And even teenagers, unfortunately, not necessarily because they're doing anything silly, but maybe don't have the swimming skills to be able to keep themselves afloat. And so if you feel like it's been busier these last few summers, you are correct. I think, pretty early on in that first summer of 2020 of the pandemic, it was noted and responded to with increased education that we were seeing more drowning or submersion injuries as a result of people being home more and or trying to be at relatives' house outdoors more often. And so we saw an increase in these numbers. So the blue line is pre-pandemic, that's 2019, and I want to thank Josh Smith for getting this dashboard up and going so that we can be monitoring these numbers and producing these graphs for us. But if you look at June through August for the last 3 years, you'll see those numbers have really increased. So 2019 in those 3 months had about 23 cases that were EMS responded to, but by 2020 there was almost a 50% increase at 32 cases, about the same for 2021 at 31 cases. And unfortunately, this year, numbers have actually gone up. So we've had 37 cases June through August of this year. And September, as you can see, is on track to be above the prior years as well. So this is something that has unfortunately recurred as a continued problem, worsening problem at this point, despite many of the efforts that are being made in the community to educate. So what is important from a clinical perspective is really getting these kids ventilated. So, so much of the damage that is done is a result of the hypoxemia across the different organ systems and mechanisms. So ventilation is really the most important initial treatment. It's not clear that that will have a huge impact on neurologic outcome, but it is still the primary most important thing that you can do for these individuals. And if even if we're not clear on the neurologic outcomes, we know that it can help with some of those other organ systems listed. The toddlers really are not likely to have a cervical spine cord injury associated. That might be your teens who are doing some high-risk behaviors, but many of the responses that you'll report to are not as a result of traumatic submersion injuries, but the ventilation is something to make sure that is universally prioritized. Okay, so I'm sure these photos are not unfamiliar to many of you. I think it's hard to go anywhere in San Diego right now and not see kids and teens on their e-bikes. It seems like just an explosion of these have happened in my own community. And many times I'm seeing kids doing these exact same things, which are very unsafe practices of multiple riders or not wearing proper headgear, head protection as well. And so really the emphasis here beyond, addressing, of course, their traumatic injuries is really enlisting, or I'm encouraging to enlist your help in helping with education and prevention of injury in our community, because there really is just a lack of understanding of the frequent risks that kids are taking when they're not following proper safety precautions. And it's not just those that are on the bikes that are at risk. With this increase in e-bikes, we're seeing more and more these pedestrians that are being impacted as well. And I'll give you some statistics on that as well. But this is a case that happened here locally where a 6-year-old was actually hospitalized, and it was another teenager. Actually, it was a teenager who hit him on the beach, and that is not uncommon. So when we look at the statistics for e-bikes, it is a little bit challenging because a lot of times those e-bike injuries are blended into other injuries. So they may be blended in with other motorized vehicles, so to speak, of e-scooters or hoverboards. They may be blended in with pedal bikes instead. But I was able to pull out some statistics from the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission. These numbers in this first dot point are a few years old, so likely those numbers are even higher now. But even from 2017 to 2019, they noted 41 Americans who had been killed, over 130,000 injured by e-bikes, hoverboards, and e-scooters. Over this period of time in the surveillance system from 2000 to 2017, there was 0.13 injuries for every 10,000 injuries that's specific to e-bikes. But e-bikes victims, although that might not be a huge volume, a large volume of them are getting internal injuries as a result. So 17% of e-bike accidents specifically resulted in the victim having internal injuries. That's relative to the 7.5% you might see with powered scooters or with pedal bikes. And it was largely males. Again, we know when these are teens or preteens, males may have that higher risk-taking behavior that keeps them from being safe. But in this case, 83% of the time, it was males that were receiving these more traumatic injuries. And then, as I mentioned, the likelihood of colliding with a pedestrian is actually 3 times higher than it is with a powered scooter or a pedal bike. So again, this really comes down to those riders not recognizing what the safe way to do it is. And so as you can tell, my kids, when I work at home, my kids are in and out of my office. And my son actually walked in when I was working on this part of the presentation, and he wanted me to go outside and play with him. And I was explaining that I was working on this presentation. He said, "Mom, e-bike safety is really pretty easy. Like, you can just tell them this." And so I started typing what my 11-year-old son was saying, and realized he's pretty much hitting all the points. And so if an 11-year-old who doesn't have an e-bike can figure out how to be safe, why can't we get more people really following these things? And so we do see around our neighborhood little siblings on the back of their older brothers and sisters' e-bikes. We do see them driving down the road, but also looking at on their e-bike, but also looking at their cell phones at the same time. teenage friends, sharing a bike that's not built for more than one, lack of head protection. And then this last bullet point I thought was, or dot point I thought was very cute, because he's 11 and he said he's not ready, so you must have to be at least 12 to ride an e-bike. But really there are some actual legitimate rules out there that you can share. So he's not far off. This is from the city of Carlsbad, who has a lovely one pager that talks about e-bike rules and safety. Also goes through sort of the different requirements based on the class of e-bike that there is. And you can see that above 28 miles per hour, then is a class 3, which children are not even supposed to be using at all. So it's 16 and up for those quicker or faster motorized bikes. Helmets are required for under 18 for any type of bike, whether it be a pedal bike or any class of e-bike, and actually for all ages for those e-bikes that go faster, or that class 3 as well. And really, you know, when it comes down to, we have this recipe for danger with there being no requirement for a license or registration. These are motorized vehicles of effect, right? So they may not go as fast as a motorcycle, but they can go pretty fast. And of course, we know that license and registration is required for a motorcycle, but not for an e-bike. We talked about the age limits. They're not supposed to be on sidewalks. They're not supposed to be on trails unless that is adjacent to a road, but not sidewalks at all. And even the lowest class or class 1 e-bike has the potential for twice the speed of your commonly ridden pedal bike. So all of that adds up to much more injuries. And so here are some resources you can help share. Maybe you get called and the patient doesn't even have to be brought in to the emergency department. Maybe they're not that injured, they appear fine. That is a perfect opportunity to help educate them on where they can take a class, why it's important that they take a class. We commonly will hear that, well, I didn't know I needed that it would be any different. I've ridden bikes for years, or I've ridden a scooter for years. I thought it would be the same, but it's definitely not. And so we want to really help push these community groups that are trying to educate our youth and adults riding e-bikes on the importance of that. Okay, our little guy is back, and this time his arm went limp and his smile looks funny. So this time is a 3-year-old male, and mom reports that he did have some headache and neck stiffness and felt warm, so maybe had a bit of a fever, but what worried her and resulted in her call was that he had this sudden onset of pain and severe right arm weakness with a droopy smile. And so he had with further history, he had a cough and fever, and he had a little bit of a runny nose about 5 days earlier, but he had been improving. So she had not been concerned until this new development today. And when we look at others that have had his condition, we see that this prodromal viral illness is pretty common. That this is in kids, that it's very common, that it's an upper limb, that it's asymmetric weakness, that there might be some other neurological findings as well, but that this is often starting to improve by 10 days or less. And in this case, our young man has acute flaccid myelitis. And so these statistics come from NIH on what you see with presentation with acute flaccid myelitis. And the reason this is particularly pertinent right now is you probably did see this CAHAN alert that had come out a few weeks ago from our health department, because we are seeing an increase in the viruses that are associated with acute flaccid myelitis, particularly enterovirus D68. So about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a cluster of these cases that led to AFM. And you might have been hearing about it as a polio-like illness. That's sort of how this was presenting, and these kids were identified to have enterovirus D68. So that is what we are worried about now. I spoke with Dr. Bradley, ID doc at Rady's, and he said we are seeing a lot of rhinovirus and enterovirus that's ending up in the hospital, which is not typical for those type of viruses. Thankfully, they have not had, as of last week at least, had any AFM cases associated, but definitely on high alert for that. And so really the clinical care for this is supportive, but I think the important message is that it is investigated. So if you have a patient with acute flaccid limb weakness, especially if it's after a viral illness or fever in these upcoming months, we really want to make sure you have this on your radar screen to investigate further. And it's not the only, those are not the only viruses out there right now. And, you know, it's only September. It's not really technically flu season or winter yet, but we're seeing this, I'm seeing this in all my pediatric social media groups, discussions about how crowded and overwhelmed practices are, ERs are, hospitals are with these respiratory cases. And this is happening across the country. So this was a tweet out of a doc in Texas, where all the major metropolitan cities, or a lot of them, were without med-surg beds or ICU beds as a result of this. And it's not, of course, as I said, just rhinovirus and enterovirus. There's other enteroviruses running around, like there's a lot of hand, foot, and mouth going around right now, which might not end up being hospitalized, but may end up in an ER because sometimes those kids have pretty impressive rashes or in quite a bit of pain. Of course, we're starting to see some flu. We're seeing coronavirus still, but other coronaviruses as well. RSV has been coming and going and is not following its typical seasonal course, paraflu, pertussis, parapertussis, and more. And every single one of these viruses on here, with the exception of other coronaviruses, were on the pathogen report I got from Rades just today. So all of these are in our community right now, and many of them have no business being here in September, but they are. And so I thank you to Chris Abe over at Rades for sharing some of these next few slides with me. This is the data out of Rades looking at these increases in the respiratory viruses right now in our community. So this is in the yellow, the inpatient cases, in the blue, the outpatient cases. And you can just see over this last month, this is November through current, this last month, those cases have just risen quite quickly. When you look at the kids presenting to the ED with difficulty breathing, this is 2022 compared with other prior 5 years, January through December. And you can see that dark purple line is 2022, just significantly higher than previous years. This light blue line was 2020 when people were trying to stay away from the ER as much as possible. The other years, 2017 through 2021. Pretty consistent and pretty much seasonal, as you can see with their rises and falls, but not so much this year. This zooms in on September, which we're not all the way through yet, but you can see is just clearly distinctly above the other years as well. So this is, you know, our kids are back in school, they're passing this around. I'm not sure that this will get better before winter hits, so we might see these numbers go even higher. Okay, one last case with our little guy. This time his eyes rolled back and his body was shaking. In this case, he was having a febrile seizure. So that is a more common description for the generalized seizures. Of course, again, as I said, families don't always know what is a seizure and what isn't. So any kind of abnormal movement they may consider a seizure, but this is probably what you're going to see most commonly, because febrile seizures are the most common neurological disorder of infants and young children. It occurs in 2 to 4% of children younger than 5 years of age. And it can be pretty scary for families or parents, especially if they've never seen one before. My nephew, actually, who's now in his 20s, but when he was 18 months old, suffered a febrile seizure in a restaurant when I was with him, and I was a first-year med student, so had no clinical experience yet, and he scared me. But come to find out, he's not that rare, because as I said, 2 to 4% of children younger than 5 will have a febrile seizure. To be a febrile seizure, they do have to be 6 months to 5 years of age. So it really doesn't qualify as a febrile seizure if they fall outside of that age range, even though most commonly it is those that have just turned a year to about 1.5 years. They obviously have to have a fever, a documented fever, and no history of prior afebrile seizures. So if they've had other seizures that weren't associated with a fever, we wouldn't call a seizure with a fever, a febrile seizure in that child, because it could just be that their other condition triggered it. So these are kids without a history of other seizures, at least febrile ones, and who don't have CNS infections or inflammation or something else like a metabolic abnormality to explain the cause. So of course, a high fever is a risk factor, but there actually has been some debate about that over the years. And so previously it was sort of thought that how quickly the fever went up, maybe it didn't have to get very high, but if it jumped a degree or two very quickly, that might be enough to trigger the fever. Some of that is because younger kids actually have a lower seizure threshold. And so their fever might not get as high, but it's now believed that the height of the fever, the maximum height of the fever is really what puts them at risk. But there are other things that are sort of to keep on in mind when you're thinking about why a child might be at risk for this. Of course, infections, but really classically the HHV6 or roseola or slap cheek disease is one that is very commonly associated when you do test kids who present with febrile seizures. This is the most common organism that is associated with febrile seizures. As far as post-immunization febrile seizures, those happen as well, and MMR tends to be the culprit in those cases, although not always. There could be a genetic predisposition, but there are also some other things that may put these kids at risk for febrile seizure. So prenatal exposure to nicotine, and then iron deficiency, which we know is very common in many of our communities, and allergic rhinitis, certainly something we see throughout San Diego as well. And those are considered risk factors also. There are different types of febrile seizures. Most commonly, they are a benign, simple, generalized febrile seizure. So to be a simple febrile seizure, it does have to be generalized. It has to be pretty brief. It's usually less than 5 minutes. It needs to be singular, so not recurring in the next 24 hours. They're usually tonic-clonic, and there's a brief post-ictal period. In these scenarios, this is a benign condition, although it can come back. So about a third of kids will have more than one of these in those years of 6 months to 5 years, although again, not over a period of 24 hours. They do have a slightly higher rate of future epilepsy, but not much. But if it does meet these criteria and the kid is otherwise looking well and your exam is otherwise non-focal, it is unlikely that you will need to get an EEG or an MRI. These kids do not need a significant workup. You can definitely, kind of tuck them away if they are otherwise stable, and their primary care can have that longer conversation with the family. I often had families show up saying, well, don't we need to investigate these more things? And we can explain to them that if, they really have no other risk factors, that this is a benign condition. But there are other types. There are complex febrile seizures, and those may be with a focal onset instead of generalized. They tend to be longer, so often lasting 15 minutes or more. There could be multiple events within 24 hours. If it's a complex seizure and they haven't had any previously, it typically is the first seizure. So if they have had a complex seizure previously, they may have another one, or they may not. But if you've had a simple febrile seizure, you're unlikely to go on to have a recurrent febrile seizure be complex in the future. These kiddos often may be younger. They may have developmental delay. They constitute about 1/5 of the febrile seizures that do present, but there is a little bit even higher risk of future epilepsy for those kiddos that have a complex febrile seizure. And then very rarely you may run into a child who has febrile status epilepticus. So this obviously would be a continuous seizure or intermittent seizures without full neurological recovery. These kids will have open and deviated eyes as maybe their only sign of ongoing focal seizure activity. They may not have any motor activity associated with it. And about 1/3 of the cases, the actual seizure duration is underestimated in the ED because this can be pretty subtle. So there are a couple of clues you can look for. Looking for closed eyes or deep breath can indicate the end of the seizure. And in these cases, you might want to consider a lumbar puncture and further workup as well. There are some other things that you would want to keep in mind that might lean you towards getting that lumbar puncture besides just the status epilepticus. Oh, my screen just kind of went goofy. I don't know if yours did. Hopefully you can still see my slides okay. Okay, so I might have to stop sharing for a minute and come back, but I will keep trying. So other considerations for a lumbar puncture are if there are meningeal signs or symptoms. So as I mentioned, to be a febrile seizure, there should not be any CNS infection or inflammation. If it's a 6 to 12-month-old and they are deficient in their immunizations, particularly for Haemophilus influenza or strep, that might be an indication to get a lumbar puncture as well. Or if they're on antibiotics for another reason. So a lot of times it's an ear infection or otitis media that kind of triggers these febrile seizures. If they're on antibiotics, it could be masking signs or symptoms of meningitis. And then again, as I mentioned, typically these seizures happen on the first day of illness. So if this is not on the first day of illness, it might be another reason to think twice about discharging them without further workup. Okay, did that slide advance, Dr. Koenig?
Yes.
Okay. I'm making sure because it's really kind of goofy on my screen. So okay, so I did want to really try and find some new and unknown information about febrile seizures. But as I mentioned, this is an old classic. This has been around for a long time, and evidence is pretty well established in its management. But there was a new study that came out last year out of the NIH on COVID and febrile seizures. So of the almost 9,000 patients that they looked at retrospectively through EHR data, about 0.5% were diagnosed with febrile seizures. So not a lot, a pretty small amount. It had a pretty similar composition of mostly simple, and about 30% in this case were complex, so a little higher than that 20% we talked about before, about the same median age, but about 25% were hospitalized and 9% were in the ICU. What it didn't talk about was whether they were hospitalized because of their COVID or in the ICU because of their COVID, because those numbers do seem pretty high. I suspect that was a complicating factor that may have brought them in for admission. And I couldn't tell you, for example, what percentage of kids with roseola ended up with febrile seizure, because we aren't testing every kid for those other viruses, but we were testing for COVID. So we have a little better data for that on how common it is. Okay, so final slide here, just in conclusion. Again, seizure is not a clear term for guardians and parents. So they may describe a lot of different things in seizures, and it'll be up to you all to sort of sort that out and getting further history with your exam. But the THC edibles are something that can lead to this, especially in an acute intoxication in these toddlers. And unfortunately, they are quite appealing, these edibles, to the littler ones. For our drowning cases, again, the take-home point is that ventilation is key. For our e-bike injuries, really, I want your help in education and prevention of these injuries. Keep acute flaccid myelitis in mind when you see limb weakness, because this is something that we are worried we will start seeing a cluster of in our community. And then, of course, as you're all experiencing, there's no seasonality with these viruses right now. And finally, the febrile seizures most of the time are not going to require further evaluation. And with that, I will make myself available for questions, and I will try and stop this sharing and get my screen back. Okay, now I can see again.